Hey, welcome back to the Nero world. Today we're diving into another Nero Wolfe mystery, smart, sharp, and worth every minute. The orchids were behaving themselves that Tuesday morning, which meant Nero Wolfe was in a reasonable mood, or as close to reasonable as a man of his particular architecture ever gets. He'd come down from the plant rooms at 11 on the dot, lowered his seventh of a ton into the custom-built chair behind his desk, and was examining a monograph on the cultivation of Miltoniopsis vexillaria, with the same intensity a lesser man might reserve for a murder confession. Fritz had brought beer. The world, from Wolfe's perspective, was adequately ordered. I was at my desk, doing what I do when cases are thin, which is to say, updating files, sharpening pencils that didn't need sharpening, and constructing elaborate mental arguments for why I deserved a raise. The brownstone on West 35th Street was quiet. Outside, New York was doing its usual impression of organized chaos. Inside, we were doing our usual impression of a very comfortable library that occasionally solved murders. The doorbell rang at 11:20. I went to the front door and found a woman on the stoop who looked like she'd been arguing with herself the entire cab ride over, and wasn't sure which side had won. She was somewhere in her early 40s, well dressed in a charcoal wool coat that had cost real money. Dark hair pinned with the kind of precision that suggests either a very good hairdresser or a very controlled personality. Her face was composed, her hands were not. She was gripping a black leather handbag with both fists, as though it might try to escape. "My name is Renata Voss," she said, before I'd opened the door all the way. "I need to see Nero Wolfe. I was here yesterday. I left without coming in." That was an interesting opening. I'd have remembered her face, but I hadn't been the one to answer the door yesterday afternoon. Fritz had, and he'd mentioned a woman who'd rung the bell and then walked away before he could speak. I'd filed it under nervous clients and moved on. "You came back," I said. "That's usually a good sign. Come in." Wolfe looked up from his monograph, with the expression he reserves for interruptions, somewhere between a hanging judge and a man who has just been told his dinner will be 20 minutes late. Then he looked at Renata Voss more carefully, the way he looks at things when something about them has caught the machinery behind his eyes. And he set the monograph down. "Madam." He did not rise. He never does for anyone. "Sit down." She sat in the red leather chair across from his desk, the client's chair, as I think of it, and arranged herself with great care, as though correct posture might hold everything else together. I went to my desk and pulled out my notebook. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "my brother has been accused of forgery. In 3 days he will almost certainly be arrested. I believe he is innocent. I need you to prove it." Wolfe picked up his beer. "Why do you believe he is innocent?" "Because I know him." "Madam," his tone was patient in the way that glaciers are patient. "Siblings have been deceiving one another since Cain. Knowing a person is not the same as knowing their actions. Tell me about the forgery." She took a breath. "My brother's name is Daniel Voss. He is 46. A partner at the architectural firm Voss and Halder. 6 weeks ago, a man named Clement Strike, a property developer, a client of the firm, died. Heart failure, the coroner said. Last week, Strike's estate attorney discovered that a document had been altered. A codicil to Strike's will, handwritten and signed 3 days before his death, directing that a parcel of property in Brooklyn, worth approximately $4 million, be transferred to the firm of Voss and Halder rather than to Strike's daughter, as the original will specified. The signature on the codicil has been examined by 2 handwriting experts. One says it's genuine, one says it isn't. And the police? They've been investigating quietly for 10 days. My brother tells me a detective named Roland has been asking questions. He expects an arrest within the week. She paused. The codicil, if genuine, would make Daniel and his partner, Owen Halder, very wealthy men. If forged, if someone used Daniel's access to Strike's files and home to create that document, it would destroy him. Wolfe set down his beer, and gazed at the ceiling for a moment. I knew that look. He was deciding whether the problem was interesting enough to justify the enormous inconvenience of doing something about it. Who else had access to Strike's home and documents? That's precisely the question. Strike was a private man. He worked with very few people closely. His inner circle, if you can call it that, was small. She opened the handbag, extracted a folded sheet of paper, and leaned forward to place it on Wolfe's desk. I've written down the names. There are 4 people besides my brother who had regular access to Strike in the last months of his life. His personal attorney, a woman named Patricia Good. His business associate and sometime friend, Marcus Fell. His private secretary, a young man named Theodore Bain. And his daughter, Eleanor Strike, who stands to lose $4 million if the codicil holds. And gains $4 million if it doesn't, I observed from my desk. She glanced at me. Yes. Wolfe unfolded the paper, read it, and placed it to one side. You said your brother will almost certainly be arrested. You did not say he will certainly be convicted. The handwriting expert who says the signature is genuine is the one the estate hired. The one who says it's forged is the one Daniel hired privately. The estate's expert has more credentials. The district attorney's office, I'm told, finds the evidence compelling. She looked at Wolfe steadily. I don't want my brother to survive an arrest and a trial. I want the truth found before this goes further. And if the truth is that your brother forged the document? The question landed in the room like a dropped glass. She didn't flinch. I gave her points for that. Then I will have paid you a great deal of money to confirm it, she said, but I don't believe that's what you'll find. Wolfe was quiet for a moment. Then, my fee is $500 a day plus expenses. I will require access to anyone whose name appears on that list, as well as your brother. I will require you to answer any question I put to you honestly and completely, including questions that may be uncomfortable. And I will require you to understand that my conclusions, whatever they are mine to reach through my own method. I don't shade findings. I understand. Then we have an arrangement. He picked up his beer. Send your brother to see me tomorrow at 6 in the evening, and tell me, why did you come to my door yesterday and leave without ringing the bell? She was quiet for a moment. I was afraid of what you might find. And today? I decided I was more afraid of what the police might find instead. She stood, collected her handbag, and allowed me to show her out. At the door, she paused. My brother is not a dishonest man, Mr. Goodwin. Most people aren't, I said, until they are. She gave me a look that suggested she didn't find that comforting, which was fair enough, because I hadn't meant it to be. Back in the office, Wolfe had returned to his monograph. Archie, right here. Tomorrow morning, visit the Public Records Office and obtain whatever is available regarding the estate of Clement Strike. Then find out what you can about Marcus Fell and Theodore Bain. I want background, not gossip. Financials if accessible, professional history, any litigation. And Owen Halder, the partner? Wolfe's lips compressed slightly. A man whose business partner is accused of forging a document that would enrich them both is either a co-conspirator, a convenient alibi, or a target. I haven't yet determined which. Include him. I wrote it down. You think it's interesting? He lifted his beer. A disputed signature on a dead man's will. $4 million. And a woman who stood outside this door for... He glanced at the clock. Presumably some time before deciding to ring the bell. Yes, Archie, I think it's interesting. He went back to his monograph. I went back to my pencils, though I'd stopped thinking about the raise. I spent Wednesday morning doing what Wolfe calls preliminary reconnaissance, and what I call digging through paperwork until my eyes cross. The public records on the Strike estate were available, but thin. Clement Strike had been, as Renata Voss said, a private man. He'd built his property development business over 30 years, mostly in Brooklyn and Queens, and had accumulated the kind of quiet wealth that doesn't make the society pages. He had one daughter, Eleanor, 42, unmarried, listed as primary beneficiary in a will dated 4 years prior. The codicil in question, if valid, had been witnessed by Theodore Bain, his personal secretary. That was worth noting. On Marcus Fell, I found more. He was 53, a former real estate attorney turned property consultant, with a history that included 2 civil suits, one for breach of contract, one for misrepresentation, both settled out of court 7 years ago. He'd been associated with Strike's business dealings for over a decade in a semi-formal capacity. Not an employee, not quite a partner. The kind of arrangement that exists in the spaces between those words. Theodore Bain was 29, Columbia educated, had worked as Strike's private secretary for 3 years. Nothing remarkable in the public record. Clean as a new sheet of paper, which in my experience is either a good sign or means you haven't looked in the right places yet. Owen Halder, the architectural partner, was 60, a senior member of the firm Voss and Halder, with a reputation in commercial architecture that was genuine and well-earned. He'd been with Daniel Voss since they'd founded the firm together 22 years ago. No civil litigation, no financial irregularities in anything public-facing. By Wednesday afternoon I'd arranged, through a combination of phone calls and the particular tone of voice I use when I need people to agree to things, for all 4 names on Renata's list to come to the brownstone on Thursday. Daniel Voss was already coming Wednesday evening at 6. He arrived 7 minutes early, which told me something. People who arrive early to difficult appointments are either very anxious or very controlled. Daniel Voss looked like both. He was tall and lean, with his sister's dark coloring, but without her composure. Or rather, with a performed version of it that was working hard and showing the strain. He shook my hand firmly, looked around the office with the appraising eye of an architect, and sat in the red chair as though he'd been practicing. Wolfe entered from the hall, settled into his chair, and studied Daniel Voss for a moment, the way a botanist studies an unfamiliar specimen. "Mr. Voss, your sister tells me you expect to be arrested within days." "That's my understanding, yes." "Did you forge Clement Strike's signature on the codicil to his will?" People always blink at that. They expect preamble, context, a gentle easing in. Wolfe doesn't do gentle easing in. "No," Daniel said, "I did not." "Did you have access to his home?" "Yes. He had an office at his townhouse on Remsen Street. We met there frequently during the design phase of a project in Carroll Gardens. A residential conversion, 12 units. It was Strike's most ambitious residential project. He was very involved in the design." "When did you last visit that office?" Daniel thought carefully. 6 weeks ago. About 10 days before he died. The codicil is dated 3 days before his death. Where were you on that date? At our offices on Lexington. My partner Owen can confirm it. We had client meetings from 9 to 4. I was there all day. And your signature on file was Strike's attorney. How many people had seen it, had access to documents bearing your name? He paused. I'd signed several contracts with Strike over the years. Architectural agreements, change orders. His attorney has them. His secretary would have handled them. Strike himself kept copies. I don't know who else might have had access. Wolfe nodded. Tell me about Clement Strike. Not his business dealings, him, his character. That seemed to surprise Daniel more than the direct question about forgery had. He was precise, exacting. He knew what he wanted, and wasn't easy to redirect once he'd decided. But he was fair. He paid on time, honored agreements, and when he changed his mind he told you directly. Did he ever express to you any intention of altering his will? Something moved across Daniel Voss's face. Quick, like a shadow. No. Wolfe saw it. I saw it. Neither of us said anything about it just yet. Did he speak to you about his daughter? Once or twice. Their relationship was strained. He felt she'd never taken the business seriously. She's a painter. Works in upstate New York. He was proud of her talent and frustrated by her choices. Daniel paused. He said once that he worried she wasn't suited to managing what he'd built. but that's a long way from cutting her out. Indeed it is, Wolfe said. That will be sufficient for this evening, Mr. Voss. I may have further questions after I've spoken to the others. After Daniel left, I sat back and looked at my notes. He hesitated, I said, when you asked if Strike mentioned changing his will. He did. That's either because Strike said something he hasn't told us, or because he's lying about the whole thing. Or, Wolfe said, pouring his third beer of the evening, because what Strike said is something Daniel Voss has been trying very hard not to think about, because of what it implies. There is a difference between hesitation born of guilt and hesitation born of unwanted knowledge. He raised the glass. We shall see which it is. Thursday brought the 4 suspects to the brownstone in 2-hour intervals, and I had my notebook out for all of it. Marcus Fell arrived first, at 10, and proceeded to take up more room than the red leather chair had planned for. He was a big man, physically and temperamentally. Expansive gestures, a voice accustomed to filling conference rooms, and the practiced ease of someone who has spent decades being underestimated and profiting from it. He had a full gray beard, sharp brown eyes, and a handshake that was a fraction too firm. Terrible business, he said, before Wolfe had asked anything. Danny Voss is no forger. I'd stake my own reputation on it. You have, at least once, staked your reputation on things that didn't hold, Wolfe said mildly. I'm told there were settlements. Fell's expression didn't collapse. He was too practiced for that. But it reconfigured slightly. Ancient history, business disputes, nothing criminal. Tell me about Clement Streich's state of mind in the months before his death. Preoccupied. The Brooklyn project was behind schedule. He was also dealing with some family tension. Eleanor had been asking him for money, I think. He didn't say much about it, but you could tell. Clement wasn't a man who wore his emotions plainly, but when something was bothering him, he got quieter, more clipped. Did he ever speak to you about his will, or about changing it? He mentioned once, about 2 months before he died, that he was thinking about the legacy of the company, whether Eleanor was the right person to manage it. But Clement talked like that sometimes. It didn't mean he was writing new documents. Where were you on the day the codicil was signed? In my office. I have an assistant who can confirm it. I had calls that morning and a lunch meeting at 1. He left at noon, smooth as he'd arrived. Patricia Good, Streich's personal attorney, came at 2. She was 60, precise, and had the manner of someone who has spent her career knowing more than she says. She wore reading glasses on a chain and carried a leather portfolio that she set on her knees and never opened. She answered Wolfe's questions in complete sentences and volunteered nothing. I'm not prepared to discuss the specific contents of Mr. Streich's estate documents, she said, after Wolfe had probed that direction twice. There are legal considerations. The codicil is in dispute, Wolfe said. Its existence is a matter of public record in probate proceedings. I'm not asking you to violate privilege, Miss Good. I'm asking whether, in your professional observation, Clement Streich appeared to be a man who would make such a change without informing you in advance. A pause. She waited. He was thorough, she said finally. He did not make financial decisions impulsively. If he genuinely intended to redirect $4 million in property, I would have expected him to notify me. And did he? That's useful. Theodore Bain arrived at 4, and he was not what I'd expected. Given that he was 29 and had worked as a private secretary to an exacting older man, I'd expected either meekness or the particular overcompensating confidence of someone who'd learned to project capability. He had neither. He was calm in a way that seemed native rather than practiced. Medium height, sandy hair, wire-rimmed glasses, with a still quality about him that made you notice when he moved. He'd witnessed the codicil. That meant either he was the most important person in the room or the most careful liar. Mr. Bain, Wolfe said, you witnessed Mr. Streich's signature on the codicil. I did. Describe the circumstances. It was a Tuesday evening. I'd stayed late, I often did, to handle correspondence after the business day. Mr. Strike came to his study where I was working, and said he needed a witness for a document. He signed it. I signed below, as witness. He took the document, and locked it in his desk. Did you read it? No. He didn't invite me to. Did he explain its nature? He said it was a codicil to his will. He said it was something he'd been considering for some time, and had decided to finalize. His demeanor. Bain considered. Deliberate. Resolved. He wasn't emotional about it. It was more like completing a task he'd had on a list. And you had no doubt that the signature was his. None. I watched him sign it. The room was quiet for a moment. Mr. Bain, I said from my desk, had you ever witnessed documents for Mr. Strike before? He turned to look at me with calm, attentive eyes. Once, 2 years ago, a contract amendment. So he knew you were available and willing to serve as a witness. Yes. After he left, I swiveled my chair and looked at Wolfe. Either he's telling the truth, in which case Strike signed his own codicil, or he's one of the most composed liars I've ever watched. Wolfe's eyes were closed. There is a third possibility, Archie. He may be telling the truth about what he witnessed, without fully understanding what he witnessed. I thought about that on the walk to the kitchen, where Fritz was doing extraordinary things with Duck. Eleanor Strike came at 6, and if the others had been composed, she was something different, a kind of angry sadness that she was carrying like a piece of furniture, heavy and inconvenient, and very much hers. She was tall, angular, with paint-stained fingers she hadn't bothered to hide, and dark eyes that moved around the room as though cataloging its contents. She'd driven down from Rhinebeck, she said. She hadn't wanted to. I don't know who forged that document, she said, when Wolfe asked. I know my father didn't write it. He would never have cut me out like that, not for a firm he'd worked with for 3 years, however much he admired their work. He was aggravating and critical, and he thought I'd wasted my education, but he wasn't cruel. His attorney tells me he did not inform her of any planned change to his will, Wolfe said. Of course he didn't, because he didn't plan one. She looked at Wolfe directly. Someone used his death to steal from me. I want to know who. So does your brother, I mentioned. She turned to me. My brother is a grieving friend who is also a suspect. We are not at odds, Mr. Goodwin. I don't think Daniel did this, but I can't prove it any more than he can prove it himself. After she left, the brownstone settled into its evening quiet. Fritz brought dinner at 7, roast duck with cherries, and Wolfe gave it the full attention it deserved. It wasn't until after, over coffee, that he spoke. Archie, tomorrow morning I want everything you can find on Theodore Bain's finances for the past 2 years. You liked him for it? I found him interesting. Whether that's the same thing remains to be seen. Friday morning I made calls, pulled strings, and spent 45 minutes on the phone with a contact at a financial firm who owed me a favor from a situation I won't detail here, except to say it involved a misplaced briefcase and a very embarrassed hedge fund manager. By noon I had a partial picture of Theodore Bain's finances, and by 1 o'clock I was back at the brownstone, laying it out for Wolfe. He lives in a 1-bedroom on the Upper West Side, I said. Rent is $2,200 a month. His salary from strike was $60,000 a year. That's livable, not comfortable, not in this city. But 18 months ago, a savings account he'd held at Chase for 4 years suddenly received a deposit of $30,000. 3 weeks after that, another $20,000. $50,000, Wolfe said. In 6 weeks. After that the account went quiet. No matching income source I can identify. He didn't report any significant capital gains, according to the tax records I could access. And before you ask how I access them, don't ask. Wolfe waved a hand. He never asks. That's 18 months ago, I continued. About 6 months before Strike died. About 8 months before the codicil. A timeline that is suggestive without being conclusive. Right. He could have inherited it, won it, sold something, but $50,000 appearing in 2 chunks in 6 weeks, with no obvious source, from a young man working a $60,000 job, that's worth a question. His eyes went to the windows, where the afternoon light was hitting the corn plant in the corner, at an angle that had apparently satisfied his aesthetic requirements, since he didn't order me to adjust the blinds. "What do we know of Clement Strike's health in his final months?" he asked. "Heart condition, according to the coroner. He'd been treated for arterial disease for 3 years. The death was ruled natural. No autopsy beyond standard procedure." "Was he on medication?" I checked my notes. "Anticoagulants, blood pressure medication, the usual catalog for a man of 71 with arterial concerns." "And his medical records?" "I can't get those without a court order or a very different kind of contact than I currently have." I paused. "You're thinking the death wasn't natural?" "I'm thinking," Wolfe said carefully, "that the sequence of events rewards examination. A man of 71 with a heart condition dies. 3 days before his death, a codicil appears that redirects $4 million. The codicil is witnessed by his personal secretary, who received $50,000 unexplained dollars in the preceding year. The only handwriting expert who says the signature is genuine was hired by the estate, whose primary beneficiary under the new codicil stands to gain those $4 million. "Wait," I said. "The firm gains under the codicil, Voss and Halder." "Yes. But who engaged the handwriting expert who authenticated it?" I looked at my notes. "The estate attorney, Patricia Good, who is obligated to act in the interests of the estate, which under the codicil means acting in the interests of Voss and Halder. Unless," Wolfe said, "the codicil is disputed successfully, in which case the estate reverts to Eleanor Strike. Miss Good then serves Eleanor's interests." He laced his fingers across his considerable midsection. "Miss Good has not, so far as I can determine, expressed a strong opinion about the codicil's validity. She noted that Strike had not informed her of the change, which is a fact that cuts against the codicil, but she stopped well short of calling it a forgery. She's keeping her options open. She's being professionally cautious. I don't draw conclusions from that alone." I sat back and looked at my notes again. There was a shape forming at the edges of this thing, like a photograph developing in a dark room. I couldn't see the picture yet, but I could see that something was there. "The $50,000 to Bain," I said. "If someone paid him to witness a forged signature, then he either didn't know it was forged, which requires remarkable naivety, or he did know, which makes him a conspirator." Wolfe reached for his beer. "Or the money is entirely unrelated. We must hold all 3 possibilities." "What do you want me to do?" "Talk to Theodore Bain again. Not here. Informally, on his ground. I want to know where that money came from, and I want your impression of whether he knows more than he told us." "What's my angle?" "Routine inquiry. You're verifying details for a background report. You need not specify for whom. And Archie, while you're out, visit the building on Remsen Street where Strike had his office. The current state of the property may tell us something. It's an estate property. It might be locked. Buildings," Wolfe said with mild authority, "are rarely as locked as their owners believe." I found Bain at a coffee shop on Amsterdam Avenue, Saturday morning, which he'd agreed to after a phone call in which I was deliberately vague about my purpose, and he was deliberately agreeable about my request. Neither of us was being fully honest, which gave us something in common. He was already there when I arrived, with a coffee and a paperback that he set face down on the table when I sat. His composure was intact. It was the kind of composure that either meant a clear conscience or very good preparation. "I wanted to follow up on a few details," I said, settling in with my own coffee. "Routine stuff. The nature of your work for Mr. Strike, was it primarily administrative? Correspondence? Scheduling?" "Primarily, yes. He also asked me to manage certain personal matters, household accounts, liaising with his contractors, occasionally handling sensitive correspondence when he preferred not to be directly involved. What kind of sensitive correspondence? A slight pause. He had ongoing disagreements with neighbors over a property boundary. Some family matters he found difficult to address directly. That sort of thing. Family matters meaning his daughter? Occasionally, yes. He found direct emotional conversations difficult. He sometimes had me draft letters that he would then review and revise. Did he ever ask you to handle financial documents? Sign anything on his behalf? No. I witnessed the codicil because he asked me to be present. I never had signing authority. The codicil, he explained it to you as something he'd been considering for some time. That's what he said, yes. Did that surprise you, knowing his relationship with his daughter? Bain looked at me over his coffee cup. His eyes were steady, measuring. It surprised me, yes. He spoke of Eleanor with complicated feelings, but it wasn't my place to question his decisions. The deposit of $30,000 to your Chase account 18 months ago, I said, with the same tone I might use to mention the weather. And the $20,000 3 weeks after that. What was the source? If he was rattled, he managed it well. His expression shifted, not to alarm, but to something more careful. That's private financial information. Yes, it is, I agreed. Which means you know exactly where it came from. A pause. Outside, Amsterdam Avenue was doing its Saturday morning thing. Strollers, dog walkers, someone making a tremendous amount of noise with a delivery cart. Inside, Theodore Bain was deciding something. It was a private transaction, he said finally. I'm not prepared to discuss it without legal counsel. That's your right, I said. Though I'll mention that not discussing it with me now means discussing it with police later, at which point the circumstances will be considerably less comfortable. He looked at me steadily. I didn't do anything illegal. I didn't say you did. I asked where the money came from. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, it was from Mr. Strike. I kept my face neutral. From Strike? While he was alive. Yes. He gave it to me directly. Cash, transferred to my account. He said it was a private arrangement. Additional compensation for services he considered above and beyond my regular duties. What services? Bain picked up his coffee. His jaw was set. Services I'm not prepared to discuss without counsel. I let it sit there for a moment. Then I paid for my coffee, thanked him for his time, and left. On the sidewalk I turned up my collar against the November wind, and thought about what Theodore Bain had and hadn't said. He hadn't denied the money. He'd explained its source. And then he'd closed the door on what that source expected in return. Whatever Clement Strike had paid his secretary $50,000 for, Theodore Bain had decided it was worth protecting, even now. The Remsen Street townhouse was locked, as expected, and I didn't do anything technically inadvisable to get inside. What I did do was spend time on the block, talking to the woman who ran the dry cleaner 2 doors down, who had known Strike by sight for 15 years, and who told me, between customers, that in the month before his death, she'd seen a man she didn't recognize visit the townhouse 3 times in the evenings. Not the secretary, not the usual business visitors, someone else. Middle-aged, heavy-set, she said. A gray beard. Marcus fell. Wolfe listened to my full report Sunday evening without interrupting, which is either a sign that he's fully engaged or that he's asleep with his eyes open. In this case, I was fairly sure it was the former, because at the end, he asked 3 questions in rapid succession and then sat in silence for 4 minutes by the clock. Fell visited Strike 3 times in the weeks before his death, he said at last. Evenings, according to your witness. She's reliable within her limitations. She knows faces, not names. And Bain received $50,000 from Strike for undisclosed services. He says, I can't verify the source independently. The deposits don't list a payer. And he won't say what he did to earn them. Not without a lawyer. Wolfe reached for his beer. Monday, I want Fell and Bane here together, not at the same time, but within the same afternoon, so that each is aware the other is also being questioned. I want them to know they may have been seen together. Archie, call them and make the arrangements. Fell may not come without a reason. Tell him I've identified an inconsistency in his account of his whereabouts, and would prefer to address it privately before bringing it to the attention of the police. That will bring him. It did. Fell arrived Monday at 2, in the state of studied calm that is exactly what you get when a careful man is genuinely alarmed, but not about to show it. He took the red chair, arranged his large frame comfortably, and looked at Wolfe with the expression of a man who had decided on his approach and intended to stick to it. "You mentioned an inconsistency," he said. "Several," Wolfe said. "You told me your movements on the day the codicil was signed were confined to your office. You had calls and a lunch meeting." "That's correct." "I have a witness who places you at Clement Strike's townhouse on Remsen Street on 3 occasions in the weeks preceding his death. Evenings, not business hours. These visits were not mentioned when I asked about your relationship with him." Fell was quiet for a moment. Then he adjusted in the chair. "I didn't think they were relevant. They were personal visits. Clement and I were old friends as well as business associates. I visited him. Is that unusual?" "Evening visits, unannounced, 3 times in a month, from a man whose previous pattern with Strike was professional and daytime." Wolfe's voice was without inflection. "Unusual, perhaps, is not the word I choose. Significant might be more apt." "We were playing chess," Fell said. He'd taken it up again after his diagnosis, and wanted someone to play with. He didn't want his staff to know. He felt it made him seem idle. So we played in the evenings. It was a good answer. It was the kind of answer that is either completely true or has been prepared very carefully. I made a note. "During these visits," Wolfe said, "did he speak to you about his will?" "A beat. He mentioned once that he was considering some changes. He didn't go into detail." "Did he mention Daniel Voss or the firm of Voss and Halder in relation to those changes?" "Not specifically." "Did he ask you anything about the codicil? To witness it? To deliver it? To store it?" "No." "Mr. Fell," Wolfe's voice sharpened slightly, not loud, never loud, but with a new edge. "In your professional career, you have been party to 2 civil settlements for misrepresentation. I don't raise this to impugn you. I raise it to note that you understand the precise location of the line between truth and deception. You have been very careful today to stand on the correct side of that line. I admire the precision. But precision of that kind suggests you know exactly where the dangerous territory lies, which in turn suggests you know more about what occurred than you've chosen to share." Fell looked at him. The bonhomie had thinned. "I don't know who forged that document," he said. "If it is forged." "If," Wolfe repeated. "That's an interesting word to introduce. There are 2 experts. One says it's genuine." "Yes." Wolfe folded his hands. "There is one thing I'll put to you directly, Mr. Fell. Did Clement Strike, in your presence or to your knowledge, express a genuine intention to leave a portion of his estate to the firm of Voss and Halder?" The silence lasted 6 seconds. I counted. "He said once," Fell said at last, very carefully, "that he felt the firm had given more to him than their fee reflected. He said he thought about that sometimes." "A sentiment," Wolfe said, "is not a legal document." "No, it isn't." After Fell left, Bane arrived at 4. He had brought his lawyer, a young woman named Daria Chen, compact and alert, who sat beside him in the second chair I'd placed, and said immediately, "My client will answer questions that don't require him to disclose privileged arrangements with the late Mr. Strike." "There is no privilege between a client and his employee, absent a specific legal relationship," Wolfe said pleasantly. "But I shan't argue the point. Mr. Bane, I want to ask you something simpler. Strike's signature on the codicil. Were you aware of its specific contents?" "I was not." "You understood it to be a codicil to his will?" "Yes." "Did you know which direction the codicil turned? Whether it added a beneficiary, removed one, altered amounts?" "No." He didn't tell me. But you've since learned? Yes, from the news of the dispute. And when you learned that the codicil redirected $4 million in property to the architectural firm that had been working with him, what was your reaction? A pause. Chen touched his arm lightly. He said, "Surprise." "Surprise," Wolfe echoed. "Not confirmation, not recognition, surprise." "Yes. Mr. Bain, the $50,000 that Clement Strike paid you in the year before his death, was any portion of that related to the codicil in any way? I want a direct answer." Chen said, "My client." "No," Bain said. He said it quietly and firmly, with something in his voice that was harder than what he'd shown so far. "The money was not related to the codicil. It was for something else entirely. Something that I believe he had every right to ask me to do, and that I have every reason not to discuss publicly. But it had nothing to do with his will, or that document." The room was quiet. "Very well," Wolfe said. He reached for his beer. "Thank you, Mr. Bain. I think we're done for now." After they left, I waited. Wolfe was looking at the window again. The corn plant had not moved. "He's telling the truth," I said. "My read." "Yes," Wolfe said. "Which means the 50,000 is a red herring. Significant enough to investigate. Irrelevant to the forgery." "Then what was it for?" Wolfe's eyes came back to me. "I have a hypothesis. I will need one more piece of information before I'm willing to trust it." "What piece?" "I need to know," Wolfe said, "the exact nature of Clement Strike's relationship with his daughter, Eleanor. Not as he described it to Daniel Voss, and not as Eleanor described it to us. I need a third account. Specifically, I need to know whether Strike was, in the last year of his life, attempting to reconcile with Eleanor in any concrete way." "Who would know that?" Wolfe looked at me steadily. "Patricia Good, his attorney of 15 years. And I think, Archie, that on this point, she is going to be very willing to speak." Tuesday morning, I called Patricia Good's office, and after navigating her assistant with the patience of a saint and the persistence of a process server, got her on the line. I told her I had a specific question, that it would take less than 10 minutes, and that she might find the answer affected her professional obligations in a way she'd want to know about. She agreed to see me at 3. Her office was on 44th Street, a floor in a building that was old enough to have dignity and new enough to have functioning elevators. She was behind a desk that was clear except for one folder and a glass of water, which told you everything about how she ran her practice. She nodded at the chair across from her and waited. "I want to know about Clement Strike's reconciliation with his daughter," I said. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly, recognition. "What makes you think there was one?" she said carefully. "Theodore Bain received $50,000 from Clement Strike for services he won't discuss. Bain handled difficult family communications for Strike. Strike was estranged from Eleanor, but by several accounts, not at peace with that estrangement." I paused. "He paid someone to manage a difficult personal situation. The most obvious candidate is a sustained effort to rebuild a relationship with his daughter, handled through an intermediary because he couldn't do it directly." Good looked at her water glass. "I'm not in a position to confirm or deny. Miss Good, if I'm right, then Clement Strike was actively trying to leave his daughter in a better position than their estrangement suggested. Which means a codicil cutting her out of $4 million of property is not consistent with his intentions in the last year of his life, regardless of what a single handwriting expert says." She was quiet for a long moment. "He came to me 14 months ago," she said at last. "He said he wanted to update his estate plan. He was concerned that Eleanor wasn't financially prepared to manage what she'd inherit, and he wanted to set up a trust structure, professional management for the estate, with Eleanor as beneficiary, rather than leaving her to handle it alone. He wanted to fund the trust with the Brooklyn parcel. The same parcel the codicil redirects to Voss and Halder." "Yes," And you drafted this trust? We were in the process of finalizing it. He died before it was executed. Her voice was even, but her jaw had tightened. The codicil appeared after his death, predating the completion of the trust work I was doing with him. If he genuinely intended to cut Eleanor out, he would not have spent 14 months and considerable legal fees creating a framework to protect her. Why didn't you say this immediately? She met my eyes. Because I have a professional obligation to the estate as it stands legally. The codicil is, formally, a valid document until proven otherwise. I could not privately undermine it without instruction from a court. But you can tell me. You're not a court, and you're not the police. She folded her hands on her desk. Mr. Goodwin, whoever created that codicil, knew about the Brooklyn parcel. It's the most valuable single property in the estate, and it was not publicly associated with Strike's holdings. The number of people who knew its value and its role in his estate plan is very small. How small? Myself, my associate who helped draft the trust, Theodore Bain, who I believe handled some of the communications with Eleanor about financial planning, and anyone else Strike may have told directly. Bain knew about the parcel. He knew about the trust structure, yes. Clement trusted him with a great deal. And the reconciliation with Eleanor, Bain was managing the communication? He was the intermediary, yes. Cards, letters, occasional calls arranged through him. Clement couldn't pick up the phone and speak to his daughter without it becoming a negotiation. Bain was the buffer. I stood, thanked her, and went back out into the cold. On the sidewalk I stopped and thought about it. Theodore Bain had been paid $50,000 to manage Clement Strike's private reconciliation with Eleanor. The letters, the calls, the careful rebuilding. He knew about the parcel. He'd witnessed the codicil. But if he'd been helping Strike reconnect with Eleanor, forging a document to cut her out would be a direct contradiction of everything he'd been paid to do. Unless Bain hadn't forged the document. Unless he genuinely witnessed Strike sign it. Unless Strike had, in a final reversal, decided to do something that contradicted all of his recent intentions. I walked 3 blocks before I stopped again, or unless someone else had known everything Bain knew and had used it. Back at the brownstone by 5:30, I laid it all out for Wolfe over the pre-dinner beer that I'd started to allow myself on cases, on the grounds that working for Wolfe entitled a man to at least one reasonable vice. He listened without moving, which for a man of his size is both impressive and slightly unnerving. When I finished, he sat very still for a moment. Archie, he said, who besides Miss Good and Mr. Bain knew that the Brooklyn parcel was the centerpiece of the trust Strike was building for Eleanor? Anyone Strike told directly. Daniel Voss? He worked with Strike on Carroll Gardens, adjacent project. He might have known the parcel was valuable, but whether he knew its role in the estate fell. He played chess with Strike 3 times in the last month of his life. Intimate conversation. I paused. He said Strike mentioned considering changes. But Fell also said he didn't know the details. Wolfe was nodding very slowly. And there is one person who would have known the parcel's value, who had a financial motive related to Strike's estate, who has provided us with the most complete and internally consistent account. So consistent, Archie, that it invites scrutiny. I looked at him. You mean Eleanor? Eleanor Strike stands to receive $4 million if the codicil fails. She is the one party in this affair whose financial interest aligns entirely with the outcome of a successful forgery challenge, and she is the one party we have examined least carefully. She came to us as a victim. Victims, Wolfe said mildly, have interests. Wednesday morning, while Wolfe was with his orchids, I sat at my desk with all of my notes spread in front of me and tried to do what Wolfe does, which is to find the shape of the thing underneath the details. It's harder than it looks. Wolfe does it the way Fritz does complicated sauces. Years of practice has made the components automatic. I do it the way I do most things, methodically and with more coffee than is probably advisable. Here was the structure of it. Clement Strike had died of heart failure. He was 71 with a known cardiac condition. The death had not been suspicious at the time. A codicil appeared, witnessed by Theodore Bain, signed 3 days before death, redirecting $4 million in property from Eleanor Strike to the firm of Voss and Halder. If the codicil was genuine, Strike had changed his mind, contradicting months of work building a financial trust for Eleanor, and doing so 3 days before dying, without informing his attorney, without any witness to his reasoning, but with the full and patient cooperation of his secretary. If the codicil was forged, someone had 1. Obtained a reliable sample of Strike's signature, 2. Created a convincing document, 3. Somehow caused Bain to witness it, either by deceiving Bain about what he was seeing, or by bribing him, or by fabricating Bain's role entirely. The second handwriting expert, Daniel Voss's hire, said the signature was forged. The first said it was genuine. But here was the thing that had been bothering me since Good's office. If Bain had genuinely watched Strike sign the codicil, as Bain maintained, then either Strike had signed a forged document, which made no sense, or the signature was real and the codicil was valid. Unless Bain was lying about watching Strike sign it. But Bain had been the most stable, consistent voice in this entire affair. I picked up the phone and made a call to a forensic document examiner I'd worked with on a previous case, a woman named Hester Jall, who operated out of a cluttered office in Midtown and had the best eyes for paper in the city. I asked her one question. Was it possible to cause someone to sign a document they believed to be something else? Of course, she said. You show them a legitimate document, a contract, a letter, and you slip the target document beneath it as they sign. If the signer isn't careful, they sign the wrong page. We see it in civil fraud cases. So the signature could be completely genuine, Strike's own hand, but on a document he didn't intend to sign. Absolutely. If he thought he was signing something routine. And the paper beneath was the codicil. The signature would hold up to any scrutiny, because it would be real. I put down the phone. I sat for a moment, then I picked up my notes and went to find Wolfe, who had come down from the plant rooms and was at his desk with his second beer, looking at nothing in particular, in the way that means he's been thinking hard. I have something, I said. So do I. Share yours. I told him about Hester Jall's scenario. He listened without moving. The signature is genuine, I said. Strike signed the codicil, but he didn't know he was signing it. Someone presented him with a legitimate document and slipped the codicil underneath. Bain witnessed him signing something, genuinely, but what Bain witnessed was Strike signing what Strike believed to be a contract amendment, or a letter, or anything else routine. The codicil was the bottom page, and when Bain looked at the final document afterward, Wolfe said he saw a codicil, because by that point the real document had been removed. Or he signed as witness without fully examining the document. He said Strike took the paper and locked it away. Bain never held it. Wolfe's eyes were bright, which means Bain is not a conspirator. He genuinely witnessed Strike's signature. The signature is genuinely Strike's. The codicil itself, the legal instrument, is the forgery. The signature line is real. The document surrounding it was substituted. That's why the handwriting expert, who says it's genuine, is correct about the signature, but wrong about the document's authenticity. The signature is authentic. The document isn't. And this changes, Wolfe said slowly, the question of who could have done it. I sat down. Because you need two things: access to Strike during a routine document signing session, close enough to slip a page beneath, and the ability to prepare the codicil in advance, knowing its contents would be plausible. Who had both? I ran through the names. Patricia Good, professional access to documents, but no clear motive to redirect the estate toward Voss and Halder. Bain, access to Strike, but his entire function was to protect Eleanor's interests. Fell, evening access in informal settings, but the mechanics were difficult. Then I stopped. Owen Halder, I said. We've barely looked at him. No, Wolfe said. We haven't. I pulled up my original notes on Halder. 60 years old, Senior partner, 22-year firm, no litigation, impeccable reputation. He would gain equally with Daniel Voss if the codicil held. 4 million in property, split between partners. But unlike Daniel, who had been blindsided by the accusation, Halder had been conspicuously absent. He hadn't come forward. He hadn't hired a separate attorney. He'd let his partner's name take all the heat. Daniel Voss had the relationship with Strike, I said slowly. He was the one who met with him at the townhouse. He had access and the established connection. But that also means he's the obvious suspect. If you wanted to forge something and pin it on a natural candidate, you would choose the man who already had plausible access, Wolfe said. You would not implicate yourself if you could construct a scenario where someone else's name and association were sufficient. Halder knew about the Carroll Gardens project. He'd have known Strike, at least secondhand. But would he have had direct access to the townhouse? He would not have needed it, Wolfe said. He would have needed one occasion, one document-signing meeting, legitimately arranged, in which he was present, perhaps accompanying Daniel. And he would have needed the content of the codicil to be consistent with Strike's known sentiments, which Fell had supplied in those chess games. Strike mentioned reconsidering the legacy of the firm. Wolfe was nodding. Did Fell know Halder? I checked. I hadn't asked. I hadn't thought to ask because Halder had seemed peripheral. I reached for the phone. It took 3 calls to establish that yes, Marcus Fell and Owen Halder had known each other for at least 5 years through a mutual membership in a professional consortium in commercial real estate. They were not close friends, as far as I could determine, but they had common ground, common knowledge. I put the phone down. The room was quiet except for the traffic on 35th Street and the distant sound of Fritz doing something complicated with copper pans. Wolfe, I said. Fell fed Strike the idea, planted the suggestion about the firm's value. He attended those evening sessions and came away knowing Strike's sentiments, however vaguely. Halder, with that intelligence and Daniel's established access to cover for the forgery's plausibility, arranged one meeting where he could substitute the document. The signature is real, the witness is honest, and Daniel Voss is a perfect fall guy because his name was all over the legitimate relationship. It is a hypothesis, Wolfe said carefully. It's a good one. Good hypotheses are tested, he said, not celebrated. He reached for a fresh sheet of paper on his desk. Invite them all. Thursday evening, every one of them. I will test it in the room. Getting all 5 people to the brownstone on a Thursday evening required different approaches. Eleanor Strike, I told the truth to, or enough of it. I said Wolfe had reached conclusions he wished to share before going to the police. She was on the road from Rhinebeck by noon. Patricia Good came because she understood, in the professional code she operated by, that attending was the action of a person with nothing to hide. Fell I invited by telling him I'd spoken to his connection to Owen Halder and had some questions. He arrived, looking like a man who has recently moved several chess pieces on a board he thought only he was watching. Theodore Bain, I called last, and simply said Mr. Wolfe wished him present as a witness who might need to clarify his testimony. He said he'd be there. Owen Halder was the difficult one. He said he wasn't sure what he had to contribute since the matter concerned his partner Daniel's activities. I said that was precisely why he should come, to speak in Daniel's defense. He said he'd think about it. An hour later he called back and said he'd be there. That was the call I found most interesting. They assembled in the office by 7, all 6 of them, plus Daniel Voss, whom Renata had brought without being asked, which showed good instincts. Fritz brought coffee. Nobody drank it. Wolfe came in at 7:10, settled into his chair, and looked at them all with the expression he uses when the work is complete and the exposition remains. Good evening. I'll be direct. I know who is responsible for the document that has caused this difficulty, and I intend to explain it fully tonight. What happens afterward is a matter for the police and the courts, but it will not involve Daniel Voss. Daniel, in the corner chair, looked at Renata. Renata looked at Wolfe. Fell looked at the window. Halder looked at his hands. The codicil is a genuine document in one respect, and a forgery in every other, Wolfe began. Clement Strike's signature is authentic. He signed it. But he did not sign it as a codicil. He signed it believing he was signing something entirely routine, while the codicil itself was the bottom page of what he believed to be a normal document. Theodore Bayne witnessed him signing, and witnessed honestly, as he has insisted throughout, because Strike was genuinely signing at that moment. What Mr. Bayne did not witness was the substitution, because the substitution did not happen in that room. It happened beforehand, in the preparation of the document itself. Bayne had gone still. He signed something else, he said softly, to himself. He did. He did not knowingly authorize that codicil, which is consistent with everything we know of his actual intentions. He was rebuilding his relationship with Eleanor. He was completing a trust structure with Miss Good to protect her. He was not cutting her out. He was a man with a heart condition who signed a document he believed to be routine and died 3 days later, having never known that his signature had been used as a component in a fraud. Eleanor's hands were pressed flat on her knees. The person who committed this fraud, Wolfe continued, required 3 things. Knowledge of Strike's sentiments about the firm, specifically his expressed feeling that Voss and Halder had given him more than their fee reflected. Knowledge of the Brooklyn parcel and its value, and one occasion of access to Strike during a document signing session, in a context sufficiently routine that the substitution would not be noticed. He let that sit for a moment. Marcus Fell provided the first element. He spent 3 evenings with Strike in the weeks before his death, nominally playing chess. During those conversations, Strike expressed, as he had to others, a vague feeling about the firm's service. Fell registered that sentiment and relayed it. I cannot at this time determine whether Fell's participation was active conspiracy or careless conversation with the wrong person. That distinction will matter to a prosecutor. Fell's face was a careful construction. I don't know what you're suggesting. I am not suggesting, Wolfe said, pleasantly but with iron underneath. I am describing. Please don't interrupt. Fell was quiet. The second element, knowledge of the parcel's specific value and its role in the estate, was accessible to anyone who knew the framework of Strike's estate planning. Miss Good, Mr. Bayne, and anyone who had been told directly by Strike. And Owen Halder is a man who has spent 40 years in commercial real estate development in this city. He is also a man whose professional acquaintance with Marcus Fell dates back 5 years through their shared consortium. Halder looked up. His expression was neutral in the way that takes effort. The third element, Wolfe said, required 1 meeting. I believe that meeting occurred 6 weeks before Strike's death, when Daniel Voss visited the Remsen Street townhouse to discuss the Carroll Gardens project. I believe Owen Halder accompanied him on that occasion, not as an unusual intrusion, but as the senior partner reviewing the project's status. I believe that during that meeting, a routine document was signed, a contract amendment, a change order acknowledgement, and that the codicil was the bottom page. I watched Halder. His breathing had changed, almost imperceptibly, but I've watched enough people in that room to notice. How would he have gotten Strike's signature on the codicil document itself? Daniel Voss asked, his voice controlled. The signature has to match. The codicil was prepared with a blank signature block, Wolfe said. Strike's genuine signature, placed on what he believed to be a contract page, was transferred, either photographically or through careful physical manipulation, to the prepared codicil document. Modern reproduction technology makes this achievable. The key is that the signature itself is genuine. Only the document is fabricated. Eleanor Strike said, very quietly, "He did that to my father." Wolfe looked at her. Yes, and he positioned the evidence to point at your father's most frequent visitor, Daniel Voss, whose association with Strike provided both a plausible motive and the appearance of opportunity. Halder said, "This is speculation." Some of it, Wolfe agreed. The police will determine what is speculation and what is fact. They will examine the document for signs of photographic reproduction. They will trace your movements on the relevant date. They will inquire into your relationship with Marcus Fell and the conversations you may have had. They will also, I suspect, find it instructive that when your partner's name was being attached to a forgery that would benefit you equally, you contributed nothing to his defense. He paused. A guilty man's silence is not silence at all. It is a statement. The room was very quiet. Then Halder stood up. He stood slowly, unhurried, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something, some final, careful denial. Instead, he straightened his jacket, looked at Daniel Voss for a long moment, and then looked at the door. "Mr. Halder," I said. I was already out of my chair. "I'd appreciate it if you stayed." He looked at me. Then he sat back down. It was the action, I thought, of a man who understood that the geometry had shifted and that the exit he'd been calculating was no longer available. The police came at 9. Inspector Kramer, to whom I'd made a call at 8:30, was not delighted to be summoned on a Thursday evening, but he had long since resigned himself to the fact that when Wolfe summoned you, the alternative was finding out the next morning that you'd missed something that mattered. He came with 2 detectives and the expression of a man doing complex arithmetic in his head. Wolfe gave him the summary in 12 minutes. Kramer asked 8 questions. 3 of them I could have predicted. The other 5 showed he was paying attention. At 10:15, Owen Halder left the brownstone in the company of 2 detectives. He had not confessed. He had not spoken after the single protest. But a man who says nothing after being named as the architect of a fraud that would cost a woman $4 million and destroy his partner's career is saying something very clearly, just not in words. Marcus Fell was asked to come to the precinct for a voluntary conversation. He went, still smooth, still careful, though the edges were showing now. Whatever his precise role, information supplier, active co-conspirator, or something in between, that would be for Kramer's people to determine. Theodore Bain sat in his chair after everyone else had left, looking at the floor. When he finally looked up, he looked at Wolfe. "He used me," he said. "He used a great many things," Wolfe said, "without particular sympathy, but without cruelty either, including your honest testimony, your genuine witnessing, and Clement Strike's own hand. The construction was efficient. What about the money, the 50,000? What was it for, Mr. Bain?" Bain was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mr. Strike had a son, from a first marriage, before Eleanor's mother. The son had been estranged for 30 years. Strike wanted to locate him, make contact, determine whether he had made something of himself. He didn't want it known. He hired me to find the son, make discreet contact, and report back." He paused. "The son had died. 7 years ago, I found a grave in Ohio, and a daughter, Strike's granddaughter, who didn't know he existed. I was managing that situation when Strike died." The room absorbed this. A man who'd spent the last year of his life trying to rebuild 2 broken relationships, one through letters managed by his secretary, one through the search for a lost child, and someone had used his death and his signature to steal from his daughter. "The granddaughter," Wolfe said. "Miss Good should be informed." Bain nodded. "I know." After Bain left, it was just the 3 of us, Wolfe, me, and Fritz, who had appeared quietly with beer and 2 glasses, and the particular expression he wears when he considers a situation fully settled and the house returned to its proper function. Renata Voss called at 11. I told her the short version. She was quiet for a moment, and then said, "He's not going to be arrested." "No. Goodwin, thank your brother for keeping a clean schedule on the day in question," I said. "His alibi held up because it was true." She said goodnight, and I put down the phone. Wolfe was finishing his beer with the deliberate appreciation he brings to the end of good things. "The mechanics were elegant," I said. "Halder's, I mean," grudgingly, The mechanics were intelligent, Wolfe corrected. Elegance implies efficiency and beauty in equal measure. There was nothing beautiful about it. A man in his final year of life, attempting to mend what he'd broken, was turned into an instrument of theft by someone who understood exactly what he was signing and exactly how to use it. It is, Archie, among the meaner varieties of crime, not passionate, not desperate, but calculated. For $4 million. For $4 million, he agreed, which will not be worth much to Owen Halder in the years ahead. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. The brownstone was doing its late-night thing, the particular quiet of a building that has decided the day is over. Somewhere up above, the orchids were sleeping in their temperature-controlled rooms. Fritz was in the kitchen. The corn plant was where it always was. One thing, I said. Fell. Do you think he knew what Halder intended? Wolfe considered. I think Marcus Fell is a man who asks questions and listens to answers and makes himself useful to people without ever committing himself to the consequences. Whether he knew precisely what Halder would do with what he learned from those chess evenings, I doubt it. Whether he suspected enough to be culpable, that is for lawyers to determine. He set down his glass. He will be made uncomfortable. He may deserve more than discomfort. The law will find its own level. And Eleanor? She will inherit what her father intended her to have. And she will learn, if Miss Good is thorough, that she has a niece in Ohio. Whether that is a gift or a complication will depend entirely on the personalities involved. You're in an almost philosophical mood, I observed. It is nearly midnight. The beer was excellent, and the case is concluded. He pushed his bulk carefully out of the chair and stood. I am going to bed, Archie. In the morning, I am going to the plant rooms, and I do not wish to be disturbed before 11, unless the building is on fire. What if Kramer calls? Kramer has what he needs. He moved toward the door. Good night. I sat for a while after he'd gone, in the lamplit quiet of the office, with my notebook and my cold coffee and the slight but reliable satisfaction that comes from watching a complicated thing become simple. Halder had built his scheme on the assumption that a dead man's signature and an honest witness and a plausible suspect would hold together long enough for the estate to settle. He'd underestimated the woman who stood outside a brownstone door on West 35th Street for long minutes before deciding to ring the bell. People underestimate that kind of quiet determination all the time. In my experience, it's the most dangerous kind. I closed my notebook, turned off the desk lamp, and went to bed. The orchids, presumably, bloomed on schedule.